The ground shook for 43 seconds on the morning of October 9th, 1851, and when it stopped, 7 cabins in the northern Montana Territory lay in ruins. Soren Eriksson's cabin, suspended on 4 massive iron spring assemblies that every trapper in the region had mocked for 2 years, stood perfectly intact without a single cracked log. Before we dive into how one Norwegian trapper's obsession with ground movement changed frontier construction forever, let us know where you're watching from. And if engineering stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of frontier innovation is even more impossible than this one. Soren Eriksson had survived 7 winters in the Montana Territory by the spring of 1849, and he considered himself neither lucky nor particularly skilled. He was simply careful. He checked his trap lines in the same methodical pattern every morning. He maintained his equipment with obsessive attention. He built his fires small and his supply caches large. These habits had kept him alive in country that killed careless men with efficient brutality, and he saw no reason to change them. His cabin sat near the confluence of 2 creeks in a valley surrounded by pine forest and distant mountains. The location provided excellent beaver trapping and enough isolation to avoid conflicts with other trappers working the region. He had built the cabin himself 3 years earlier using techniques every mountain man knew. Cut logs from nearby timber, notch the ends so they interlocked at corners, stack them until the walls reached 7 feet, fill the gaps between logs with moss and mud, add a roof of poles and bark, and you had shelter adequate for survival. The structure measured 16 feet square with a single door, 1 small window covered with oiled paper, and a fire pit in the center with a smoke hole in the roof. Soren had added refinements over time. He had chinked the gaps more carefully than most men bothered with, using clay mixed with grass instead of simple mud. He had built a sleeping platform raised off the dirt floor. He had constructed a proper door from split planks instead of hanging a hide over the opening. These improvements made the cabin more comfortable than standard trapper accommodations, but it remained fundamentally identical to hundreds of other cabins scattered across the northern Rockies. Soren shared his camp that spring with another Norwegian trapper named Kjell Bergman, though their partnership was one of convenience rather than friendship. They had met the previous fall and agreed to work adjacent trap lines through the winter. Kjell occupied his own cabin a mile upstream. The arrangement allowed them to share certain resources and provide emergency assistance if needed, while maintaining the solitude most mountain men preferred. On the morning of May 14, 1849, Soren left his cabin before dawn to check his trap lines along the eastern creek. The routine was identical to hundreds of previous mornings. He carried his rifle, his skinning knife, spare traps, and a leather bag for any pelts he collected. The spring runoff had subsided enough that the creeks ran clear and cold, but not dangerously high. Beaver activity showed in fresh-cut saplings along the banks. It promised to be an ordinary day of an ordinary trapping season. He was 2 miles from his cabin when the earth moved beneath his feet. The sensation lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though Soren's mind stretched it into something longer. The ground rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Pine trees swayed without wind. A sound came from deep below, a grinding rumble that felt wrong in ways Soren couldn't articulate. He dropped to one knee instinctively, gripping his rifle, though it offered no defense against what was happening. Then the motion stopped. The forest returned to normal. Birds that had gone silent began calling again. Soren stood slowly, testing his balance, wondering if he had imagined it. He hadn't. As he walked back toward his cabin, he saw evidence everywhere. Fresh cracks split the earth along the creek bank. A section of hillside had slumped downward, leaving raw soil exposed. Several large rocks had tumbled from higher ground and now lay scattered across his usual path. The earthquake had been real and significant enough to reshape the landscape in small but visible ways. His cabin still stood when he reached the clearing, but damage revealed itself upon closer inspection. The door no longer hung straight in its frame. The top corner had separated from the logs by nearly 2 inches, creating a gap that let daylight through. Inside, items had fallen from his shelves. His coffee pot lay on the floor. Clay vessels he used for storing dried meat had tipped over, spilling their contents. More concerning was what he found at the cabin's northeast corner. The notched logs that formed the corner joint had separated slightly. He could fit his knife blade into a gap that hadn't existed that morning. The logs above and below hadn't moved uniformly. Instead, the corner had shifted in a way that compromised the structural integrity of the entire wall. He pressed against the exterior logs and felt movement that shouldn't exist in solid construction. Soren spent the afternoon making temporary repairs. He forced the door back into rough alignment and secured it with leather strips. He re-chinked the corner joint with fresh mud and clay, packing it tightly into the new gaps. He reset the fallen items and cleaned up spilled supplies. By evening, the cabin appeared normal again to a casual observer. But Soren couldn't stop thinking about what he had felt during those 15 seconds. The earth was not solid. It moved. He had always known this intellectually. Everyone knew earthquakes occurred in mountain country. But experiencing the ground behaving like liquid, feeling the fundamental instability of what seemed most permanent, had shifted something in his understanding. That night he lay on his sleeping platform listening to small, settling noises from the cabin's structure. Each creak made him wonder if another earthquake was beginning. He thought about the corner joint that had separated. He thought about how the doorframe had warped. He thought about what would happen if a stronger earthquake struck, one that lasted longer than 15 seconds. Most men would have repaired the damage and forgotten about it. Soren couldn't. The ground beneath him had revealed its true nature, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. Shel Bergman thought Soren had lost his mind. The two men met 3 days after the earthquake to discuss their trap lines and trade supplies. Shel's cabin had suffered similar minor damage, which he had repaired in an afternoon and dismissed as an unusual but unimportant event. When Soren began asking detailed questions about how the ground had moved, how the damage had manifested, whether Shel had noticed any pattern to the structural failures, the older Norwegian gave him a strange look. "It was an earthquake, Soren. The ground shook. Things fell down. We fixed them. What's there to study?" Shel gathered his supplies and left earlier than usual, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. But Soren continued studying. He walked the perimeter of his cabin daily, measuring with pieces of string how much the structure had settled into the ground over the following weeks. He noticed that the settling wasn't uniform. The southeast corner sank slightly more than the others because the soil there was softer. This created stress on the log joints that accumulated over time. He examined other trappers' cabins when he traveled to the trading post, noting how foundations interacted with the earth beneath them. Most cabins sat directly on the ground or on simple stone piers at the corners. The stones provided minimal elevation to reduce rot from ground moisture, but they created a rigid connection between earth and structure. When the earth moved, the structure had no choice but to move with it. Soren began to see this as a fundamental design flaw that everyone accepted because they didn't know any alternative existed. Other trappers noticed his odd behavior. Bjorn Anderson, a Swedish trapper who worked territory 20 miles south, encountered Soren crouched beside an abandoned cabin, examining how frost heave had lifted one corner higher than the others. "You becoming a farmer, Soren? Spending more time studying dirt than checking traps?" The joke spread through the small trapping community. Men who saw each other rarely still managed to share news and gossip when they met at the trading post or crossed paths in the wilderness. Soren couldn't explain what he was looking for because he didn't know himself. He only knew that rigid foundations fought the earth instead of accommodating it. He watched how different soil types responded to moisture and temperature changes. He observed seasonal frost heaving and how it affected structures. He dug test holes near his cabin to understand the soil composition at different depths. By midsummer of 1849, Soren had a reputation. He was the Norwegian who had become obsessed with ground movement. Men joked that the earthquake had rattled his brain. Even Shell stopped visiting, uncomfortable with his former partner's strange preoccupation. Soren worked his trap lines adequately, but without the focus that had characterized his previous seasons. His mind was elsewhere, circling a problem he couldn't quite articulate, seeking a solution he couldn't yet imagine. The journey to the trading post took 3 days by horseback from Soren's cabin. He made the trip in late July of 1849 with a season's worth of beaver pelts packed on 2 horses. The trail crossed rough terrain, following creek beds and game paths through dense forest before descending into the broader valley where the trading post operated. Soren had made this journey a dozen times and normally paid little attention to the mechanics of travel. This time was different. His pack horse carried approximately 200 pounds of furs, traps, and supplies. The trail was unusually rough that summer. Spring flooding had washed out sections and left rocks and debris scattered across the path. The horse navigated obstacles constantly, stepping over fallen logs and around boulders, ascending and descending steep grades. Yet when Soren checked his cargo after several hours of difficult travel, everything remained secure and undamaged. The load hadn't shifted despite constant jarring motion beneath it. He stopped and examined how he had secured the packs. Leather straps held the cargo to a wooden frame that sat on the horse's back. But between the frame and the horse's back was a pad, and beneath that, the horse's own musculature provided natural cushioning. The system isolated the cargo from the horse's movement through multiple layers of compliance. The horse absorbed the trail's roughness through its legs and body. The padding absorbed the remaining motion. The cargo experienced only a fraction of the ground's actual movement. Soren stood beside the trail for 20 minutes, studying this system he had used for years without really seeing it. The principle was elegant. You couldn't prevent the ground from moving, but you could prevent that movement from transferring to what sat above it. Isolation through compliance rather than rigid connection. The thought felt important, though he couldn't yet articulate why. At the trading post, Soren sold his furs to Sven Karlsson, a dour Swedish merchant who operated the primary supply depot for trappers working the northern Montana territory. While Sven tallied the value of his pelts, Soren wandered to the adjacent blacksmith shop run by Gunnar Sorensen, a Danish metalworker who served the mining, trapping communities. The shop smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. Gunnar was shaping a piece of metal on his anvil, heating and hammering it into a tool whose purpose Soren couldn't identify. But what caught his attention was equipment stacked against the shop's back wall. Large coil springs, each perhaps 2 feet tall and a foot in diameter, made from iron rod, wound into tight helical shapes. They looked like giant versions of the small springs used in wagon suspensions. "What are those for?" Soren asked when Gunnar finished his hammering and thrust the glowing metal into a water trough. "Mining equipment," Gunnar replied. "Stamp mills use them to absorb impact from the crushing mechanism, keep the whole structure from shaking apart." He pulled the metal from the water and examined it critically. "Why? You need springs for something?" Soren stared at the coiled iron cylinders and felt pieces of an idea beginning to connect in his mind. Soren returned to his cabin in early August with an idea that felt simultaneously brilliant and insane. If springs could isolate mining equipment from vibration and cargo from rough terrain, they could isolate a cabin from ground movement. The principle was identical. Place springs between the earth and the structure, and the structure would float above whatever the ground did. Earthquakes would compress and release the springs instead of tearing apart rigid joints. Frost heave would be absorbed rather than transmitted into walls and corners. He needed to discuss the concept with someone, to test whether it made sense or whether the earthquake had indeed damaged his thinking. Shell had stopped visiting entirely, so Soren rode south to Bjorn Andersson's territory. He found the Swedish trapper processing pelts outside his cabin and explained his idea carefully. Springs at each corner of a cabin, the entire structure elevated and isolated from the ground. Motion absorbed by spring compression instead of structural damage. Bjorn listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from interest to confusion to something resembling concern. When Soren finished, Bjorn set down the pelt he was working on and spoke slowly, as if addressing a child. "You want to build your cabin on bed springs? Soren, that's the stupidest thing I've heard in 7 years of mountain living. Cabins sit on the ground. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. But what if nothing?" Bjorn stood and walked to his own cabin, slapping the solid log wall. "This is 2,000 pounds of wood sitting on stone piers. It's stable because it's heavy and rigid. You put that on springs and the first wind will knock it over. The first snow load will collapse those springs flat. You'll wake up one morning with your cabin on the ground and a pile of bent metal underneath." Soren tried to explain load distribution and compression ratios, but Bjorn wasn't interested in technical arguments. "You're talking about wasting money on iron, wasting time on fabrication, and building something that'll fail the first time it's tested. If you're that worried about earthquakes, build thicker walls. Use better corner notching. Don't try to make your cabin float on springs like some kind of circus wagon." The conversation ended badly. Bjorn made it clear he thought Soren's isolation had affected his judgment. "Spend more time with people and less time staring at dirt," he suggested as Soren left. Over the next month, Soren mentioned his spring foundation concept to 4 other trappers he encountered. The reactions ranged from polite dismissal to open mockery. Magnus Nilsson, a traveling Norwegian who carried news between isolated camps, thought it was the funniest thing he'd heard all season. "Eriksson wants to build a cabin that bounces. Wait until I tell the boys at the post." By September, Soren's idea had spread through the trapping community as an amusing story about a man who had gone strange after an earthquake. He was now known as the Norwegian who thought cabins should float on springs. Men he barely knew had opinions about his foolishness. The mockery was consistent and universal. But Soren couldn't let the idea go, even as social isolation deepened around him. Winter of 1849 arrived early, trapping Soren in his cabin for days at a time between storms. He used the isolation productively, working through problems that the spring foundation concept presented. He had no formal education in engineering or mathematics beyond basic arithmetic learned in childhood in Norway. But he had practical intelligence and the ability to think through physical problems methodically. The first question was weight. How much did a cabin actually weigh? He estimated his current structure contained roughly 60 logs, each approximately 12 feet long and 10 inches in diameter. Pine logs of that size weighed about 150 pounds each. That meant 9,000 pounds of wall logs alone. Add the roof structure, another 1,500 pounds. Interior furnishings and supplies, perhaps 300 pounds. Total dry weight, approximately 11,000 pounds. But winter added snow load on the roof. 2 feet of heavy wet snow across a 16-foot square roof added another 4,000 pounds during winter months. 15,000 pounds total in worst conditions. Divide that across 4 corner springs, and each spring needed to support 3,750 pounds while maintaining enough compression reserve to absorb dynamic loads from earthquakes or settling. The numbers felt absurdly large. Could springs even be made to handle such weights? He remembered the mining equipment springs in Gunner's blacksmith shop. Those had been perhaps 2 feet tall and a foot in diameter, made from iron rod maybe an inch thick. If mining equipment used springs to absorb impact from stamp mills, which certainly weighed thousands of pounds, then springs capable of supporting a cabin were theoretically possible. The question became one of scale and fabrication. Soren began sketching designs on pieces of bark using charcoal from his fire. He drew springs in cross-section, trying to understand how compression worked. A coiled spring compressed when weight pressed down on it. The coils moved closer together, storing energy in the deformed metal. When the load decreased or shifted, the spring released that energy by expanding back toward its original shape. The key was ensuring the spring never compressed completely flat, which would eliminate its ability to absorb additional motion. If each spring compressed by half under the cabin's static weight, it would retain 50% compression capacity for dynamic loads. That meant springs needed to be tall enough that half compression still left significant height. He calculated that springs approximately 6 feet tall when uncompressed would compress to about 3 feet under cabin weight, leaving 3 feet of travel for earthquake motion. But springs that tall would need to be made from very thick iron rod to avoid buckling under lateral forces, and they would need to be wide in diameter to provide stability. He estimated 3 feet in diameter minimum, composed of coils stacked in multiple layers. Each spring assembly would require hundreds of pounds of iron shaped into precise coils. The fabrication challenge was enormous. The cost would be staggering, and he still had no guarantee the concept would actually work when built at full scale. Every trapper he'd spoken to had declared the idea stupid and impractical. Maybe they were right. Spring returned to Montana in late April of 1850, and Soren rode to the trading post with a specific purpose. He needed to convince Gunnar Sorensen to fabricate 4 massive spring assemblies, and he knew the blacksmith would refuse. Gunnar was a practical craftsman who built what customers needed using proven techniques. He had no interest in experimental projects, especially ones the entire trapping community considered foolish. Soren found Gunnar in his shop working on horseshoes. He waited until the blacksmith finished and set his hammer down before speaking. "I need springs made, 4 assemblies, each capable of supporting 4,000 pounds, coiled iron, approximately 3 feet in diameter, 6 feet tall when uncompressed." Gunnar stared at him for a long moment. "You're serious about this cabin on springs nonsense? Soren, I'm not wasting my time and materials on something that'll fail. I'll pay double your standard rate. No, triple rate." Gunnar shook his head. "It's not about money. It's about reputation. When your cabin collapses or tips over or whatever happens when you try this stupid idea, people will know I made the springs. They'll think I'm as crazy as you are. I can't afford that. I have a business to run." Soren had anticipated this objection. He had spent the winter trapping season working harder than any previous year, checking trap lines in weather that kept other men in their cabins, taking risks to maximize his fur harvest. He had sold everything that morning to Sven Carlson for $640, the best season of his career. It represented 8 months of dangerous work in brutal conditions. "I'll pay you $600, Soren said quietly. "The entire amount, up front." Before you start work, Gunnar's expression changed. $600 was more than he typically earned in a full year from his blacksmith shop. It was a fortune by frontier standards. $600 for 4 spring assemblies? Yes, with one condition. You never tell anyone you think it won't work. You take the job as a craftsman fulfilling a customer's specifications. When people ask, you say you built what I ordered, nothing more. Gunnar walked to the front of his shop and looked out at the trading post yard, thinking, $600 would pay for new equipment, expand his shop, secure his family's finances for 2 years. It was impossible to refuse that amount of money, even for a project he considered doomed to fail. "If this doesn't work, you don't mention my name," Gunnar said finally. "You tell people you made the springs yourself or found them somewhere. Agreed?" "Agreed. And you pay up front. All $600 before I heat the first rod." Soren counted out the money in gold and silver coins. Gunnar counted it twice, then locked it in his strongbox. "You're either brilliant or insane, Eriksson. I honestly don't know which." "Neither do I," Soren admitted. "But I'm going to find out." Gunnar Sorensen had built tools, hardware, and equipment for 15 years, but he had never attempted anything like the spring assemblies Soren required. The technical challenges revealed themselves immediately when he began planning the work. Standard blacksmith springs were small, perhaps a few inches in diameter, made from rod stock no thicker than a quarter inch. Soren's specifications called for springs 3 feet in diameter, made from iron rod at least 1.5 inches thick. The scale transformed the project from routine metalwork into something approaching industrial fabrication. The first problem was acquiring suitable iron rod. Gunner's normal suppliers couldn't provide the quantity or dimensions needed. He sent orders to St. Louis requesting 2,000 pounds of rod stock in specific dimensions. The shipment took 6 weeks to arrive and cost nearly $200, a third of Soren's payment. When the iron finally reached the trading post in early June, Gunner spent 2 days just moving it from the freight wagon to his shop. Heating iron rod that thick required a much hotter fire than normal blacksmith work. Gunner rebuilt his forge with additional bellows and deeper coal beds. Even then, heating a 6-foot length of rod to working temperature took nearly an hour. The hot metal had to be bent around a wooden form to create the coil shape, but iron that thick resisted bending even when glowing orange. Gunner developed a technique using long lever bars and multiple anchor points to force the heated rod into curves. Each coil took a full day to form. Gunner would heat a section of rod, bend it around the form while it was hot, let it cool enough to hold shape, then heat the next section and continue. A single coil required heating and bending the rod at least 8 times to complete the full circle. Mistakes were costly. If the rod cracked during bending, which happened twice in the first week, that entire piece was wasted, and Gunner had to start over. The coils needed to be stacked in layers to create the compression tower effect Soren had described. Gunner fabricated metal spacers that held the coils in proper alignment while allowing them to compress and expand independently. Each spring assembly contained 12 coils stacked vertically, held together by 3 vertical guide rods that prevented lateral shifting while permitting vertical motion. By late July, Gunner had completed 2 spring assemblies. Each stood 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 320 pounds. The coils were rough and showed hammer marks from the forging process, but they were functionally sound. Gunner tested compression by stacking logs on top of the first completed spring. Under 2,000 pounds of weight, the spring compressed to approximately 3 feet in height. When he removed the logs, the spring returned to its original height within minutes. The iron held its shape without permanent deformation. Soren visited weekly to check progress. He said little, just examined the work carefully, and paid for additional materials as needed. Other trappers and miners who visited the trading post saw the strange assemblies taking shape in Gunner's shop. Word spread quickly. Magnus Nielsen told everyone that Eriksson's crazy cabin project was actually happening. The mockery intensified as the springs became real rather than theoretical. While Gunner fabricated the springs through the summer of 1850, Soren prepared the building site. The location he selected confused everyone who saw it. Traditional wisdom placed cabins near water sources for convenience. Soren chose a spot 50 yards uphill from the creek on a slight rise that offered no obvious advantages. Bjorn Anderson visited in early August and questioned the decision immediately. "You're making yourself haul water 50 yards uphill every day? Why not build next to the creek like a sensible man?" Bjorn walked the site, shaking his head. "And this ground is rockier than down by the water. You'll fight every post hole and foundation stone." Soren had specific reasons for every choice, though he didn't bother explaining them to Bjorn. The elevated position provided drainage that low ground lacked. Spring flooding occasionally reached the creek banks where his old cabin sat. More importantly, the high ground was visible from multiple approaches. If another earthquake struck, he wanted to see the surrounding terrain's response without trees or creek banks blocking his view. The rocky soil that Bjorn complained about actually provided more stable foundation conditions than the softer alluvial deposits near water. He spent 2 weeks preparing the site with obsessive precision. First, he cleared vegetation and leveled the ground across an area 20 feet square, larger than the cabin's actual footprint. He used string lines and a water level made from a hollowed reed to ensure the cleared area was truly flat. Any deviation would cause uneven spring compression and structural problems. Next, he excavated 4 shallow pits at the corners where the spring assemblies would sit. Each pit was 4 feet square and 1 foot deep. He filled them with layers of flat stones, carefully selecting each rock for size and shape, creating stable platforms that would distribute the spring assembly weight across a broad area and prevent sinking into the earth. The stone platforms took another week to complete. Soren rejected dozens of rocks that didn't fit his requirements, hauling stones from a rocky outcrop half a mile away. On top of each stone platform, he built a wooden base from thick timbers. These bases were 3 feet square and 6 inches thick, constructed from the best pine he could find. He joined the timbers using mortise and tenon joints, pegging them together with wooden dowels he shaped by hand. The bases needed to be absolutely flat on top to receive the spring assemblies and rigid enough to prevent warping under load. Erik Thorvaldsen, a Norwegian trapper who worked territory to the north, stopped by in mid-August and watched Soren working on the wooden bases for an hour without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. "Eriksson, this is the most effort I've ever seen a man put into a foundation. You know you could build an entire cabin in the time you're spending on this?" "I know. And you're still going to put those fool springs Gunnar's making on top of all this careful work? The springs that everyone knows won't hold?" "Yes." Erik shook his head and left without another word. That evening, Soren could see smoke from Erik's campfire 2 miles away and knew the man was telling the story to whoever would listen. The 4 completed spring assemblies arrived at Soren's building site on the 1st of September, 1850. Gunnar transported them on a heavy wagon pulled by 4 horses, the springs wrapped in canvas to prevent damage. Each assembly weighed over 300 pounds and required careful handling. Gunnar had recruited 2 miners from a nearby claim to help with the delivery, paying them from Soren's money to ensure enough labor for the unloading process. Word had spread that Assembly Day was happening, and a small crowd gathered to watch. Bjorn Anderson came, along with Erik Thorvaldsen, Magnus Nilsson, and 3 other trappers whose names Soren barely knew. They sat on logs at the clearing's edge like spectators at an entertainment, passing a bottle of whiskey and making jokes. Soren heard fragments of their commentary as he worked. $10 says the whole thing collapses before winter. I'll take that bet. I say it tips over in the first strong wind. Look at those springs. They'll rust through in 1 season and drop his cabin flat on the ground. Gunnar ignored the audience and focused on the work. Moving each spring assembly from wagon to wooden base required all 5 men working together. They used poles as levers and wooden rollers to shift the massive iron units across the ground. The springs wanted to tip during transport, their tall, narrow profile making them unstable until properly positioned. It took 2 hours to move all 4 assemblies from wagon to bases. Once positioned, the springs compressed slightly under their own weight, settling into stable positions on the wooden platforms. Soren checked each one carefully with his water level, ensuring they sat perfectly vertical and at identical heights. The precision mattered. If one spring was higher than the others, the cabin platform would rest unevenly and create stress concentrations. "Now what?" Gunnar asked when all 4 springs were positioned and verified. "You build the cabin on top of these, or you build it on the ground and lift it up somehow?" Soren had wrestled with that question all summer. Lifting a completed cabin would require equipment and labor he didn't have. "We build a platform first, heavy timbers spanning between the spring tops. That becomes the floor structure, and we build the cabin walls on top of it." He had prepared the platform timbers in advance, massive beams hewn from straight pine trees and shaped with careful attention to dimension and straightness. Each beam weighed over 200 pounds. With Gunnar and the two miners helping, they lifted the first beam and positioned it across two of the spring assemblies. The springs compressed noticeably under the added weight, settling another 6 inches. The spectators found this hilarious. "Look at that! They're already squashing flat." Magnus laughed so hard he nearly fell off his log seat. But when they placed the second beam perpendicular to the first, creating a basic frame, the structure began to show stability. Additional crossbeams filled in the platform until they had a rigid wooden deck resting on the 4 spring assemblies. The platform sat approximately 4.5 feet above the ground, swaying slightly when walked upon, but supporting weight without difficulty. Bjorn stood and approached the platform cautiously, as if it might collapse when he got too close. Construction of the cabin structure began the following morning. Soren worked alone. Gunnar had fulfilled his contract and returned to his blacksmith shop, glad to distance himself from the project now that his part was complete. The two miners had gone back to their claim. The spectators had left after assembly day, satisfied they had witnessed the beginning of an elaborate failure. Soren preferred working alone anyway. He didn't have to hear the jokes or defend his decisions. Building on the spring platform presented challenges different from standard ground-level construction. Every movement on the platform created slight motion in the springs below. Walking across the deck caused perceptible swaying. Lifting heavy logs onto the platform required extra caution because the surface wasn't fully rigid. But Soren adjusted his techniques and worked carefully, and the construction proceeded at a reasonable pace. He had selected logs for the walls weeks earlier, choosing the straightest timber he could find, and cutting them to exact 16-foot lengths. Each log was debarked and shaped to consistent diameter, roughly 10 inches throughout its length. This uniformity wasn't standard practice. Most trappers used whatever logs were convenient, accepting variations in diameter and taper. But Soren wanted logs that would stack with minimal gaps, reducing the chinking required and creating stronger walls. The corner notching followed traditional saddle notch patterns. He cut each notch carefully, ensuring tight fits that would prevent the corners from separating under stress. As the walls rose, the platform beneath compressed further under increasing weight. By the time he had stacked 10 courses of logs, approximately 5 feet of wall height, the springs had compressed to about 3.5 feet of height. The cabin now sat roughly 8 feet above the ground when measured from earth to the top of the current wall. Bjorn visited in late September and climbed onto the platform to inspect the work. He walked around the interior, testing the floor's movement with his weight. "It bounces when you walk. How are you supposed to live in something that moves like a boat on water?" "You get used to it," Soren said. Which was true. After weeks of working on the platform, the slight give under his feet felt normal. "First earthquake will throw you right out the door." Bjorn jumped up and down, creating exaggerated motion in the springs. "See? Unstable. Dangerous." "You're building a death trap, Soren." "Maybe." "Definitely." Bjorn climbed down carefully and stood looking up at the elevated structure. "Well, at least it'll be an interesting failure. Magnus is already composing the story he'll tell about the Norwegian whose cabin bounced itself to pieces." The roof went on in early October, completing the structural load. Soren had built a standard gabled roof using ridge poles and split shingles, nothing fancy but adequately weatherproof. When the final shingle was in place, the total weight caused the springs to settle to their final compressed height of approximately 3 feet. The cabin floor sat 4.5 feet above ground level, suspended on 4 columns of coiled iron that compressed and expanded visibly when he walked, from one side of the cabin to the other. Soren moved into the spring cabin in late October of 1850, and the first sensation was unsettling strangeness. The floor responded to every movement with subtle give that his body interpreted as instability. Walking from the door to the fireplace created a slight rocking motion. Sitting down suddenly caused a brief bounce. Even rolling over on his sleeping platform at night produced perceptible movement in the structure. His inner ear kept insisting the cabin was about to tip over, though logic told him the springs were simply doing what springs did. The wind was worse. A strong gust would set the entire cabin swaying in a slow, gentle motion that lasted several seconds after the wind passed. During his first windstorm in early November, Soren lay awake all night, feeling the structure rock back and forth, convinced each gust would be the one that toppled everything. But morning came with the cabin still upright and undamaged. The springs had absorbed the wind's force and dissipated it through compression and expansion, rather than transmitting it into structural stress. Snow arrived in mid-November, and Soren watched carefully as accumulation built on his roof. He had calculated snow load during his winter planning, but calculations were different from reality. 2 feet of heavy, wet snow represented thousands of pounds pressing down on the roof structure. The springs compressed another 3 inches under the added weight, settling the cabin closer to the ground. But they didn't collapse or fail. They simply held the increased load in a new equilibrium position. The real test came from the earthquakes. Minor tremors were common in the region, barely noticeable events that most people ignored. Soren felt every one of them now. The cabin would suddenly begin moving in a way that had nothing to do with wind or his own motion. A vibration would rise through the springs, translated into gentle swaying that felt profoundly wrong. These episodes lasted only seconds, but they sent his heart racing every time. His body couldn't distinguish between the cabin moving safely on its springs and the cabin beginning to collapse. By December, the social isolation was complete. Kjell Bergman had left the territory entirely, heading to Oregon for reasons he hadn't explained. Bjorn Anderson visited once in November, stayed 10 minutes, and left shaking his head. Erik Thorvaldsen passed by in early December on his way to the trading post and didn't stop, though Soren saw him pause to look at the cabin from a distance. No one wanted to be associated with the project anymore. The novelty had worn off, leaving only the expectation of eventual failure. Soren spent the long winter nights documenting everything in a journal. He measured spring compression under various snow loads. He recorded the cabin's response to wind from different directions. He noted how temperature affected the metal springs, whether extreme cold made them more brittle or less flexible. The data accumulated page after page, but he had no one to share it with, and no way to know if any of it mattered. Self-doubt became his constant companion. $600 spent, 8 months of work invested, complete social exile accepted, and for what? A cabin that moved unnervingly and might still fail catastrophically the first time a real earthquake struck. Spring of the 1851 arrived cold and late. Soren emerged from winter isolation to resume trapping, but the social landscape had shifted in ways that went beyond simple mockery. His reputation now carried a taint of instability that affected practical matters. At the trading post in April, Sven Karlsson was reluctant to extend credit against future fur sales. No offense, Soren, but a man who spends his whole fortune on bouncing his cabin might not have the best judgment about other things. Gunnar Sorensen avoided eye contact entirely when Soren visited the blacksmith shop. The spring assemblies had worked exactly as designed, but that success meant nothing compared to community opinion. Gunnar's association with the project had damaged his reputation. Other trappers joked that Sorensen had gone soft, taking money for fool's work. Gunnar blamed Soren for the ridicule and made his resentment clear through cold silence. Magnus Nilsson spread exaggerated stories throughout the territory. The spring cabin had become legend, growing more absurd with each retelling. In Magnus's versions, the cabin bounced 3 feet in the air during windstorms. Soren couldn't cook because the stove bounced around too much. The structure swayed so violently that Soren had to tie himself to his bed at night to avoid being thrown against the walls. None of it was true. But truth mattered less than entertainment value in isolated frontier communities starved for novelty. The real damage came from Erik Thorvaldsen, who was building a new cabin on his own property that spring. Erik made a show of his construction process, inviting other trappers to watch and comment. "This is how you build properly. Solid foundation, logs notched tight, no springs, no bouncing, no nonsense, just good construction that'll last decades." The implied criticism of Soren's methods was clear to everyone. Soren attended Erik's cabin raising in May, a traditional community event where neighbors helped with the heavy work of lifting logs and setting roof beams. He offered assistance that was politely declined. He stood at the edge of the worksite, watching men joke and cooperate, feeling the weight of his isolation more heavily than at any point during the winter. These were his people, fellow Scandinavian immigrants, trying to survive in brutal country, and he had separated himself from them through his obsession with an idea that no one else believed in. Bjorn Anderson approached him during a break in the work. "You could still build a normal cabin, Soren. Tear down that spring contraption before it fails and kills you. Build something sensible. People would forget about this foolishness eventually." The suggestion was meant kindly, but it landed like a blow. 2 years of work dismissed as foolishness that should be forgotten. $600 written off as wasted money. The entire concept reduced to a mistake that needed to be erased and buried. "I'm not tearing it down," Soren said quietly. "Then you're a fool." Bjorn walked back to join the other men raising Erik's solid, sensible, traditional cabin. Soren left before the work was finished. He rode back to his own cabin and sat on the ground beneath the spring assemblies, looking up at the structure that had cost him everything. Maybe Bjorn was right. Maybe he was a fool. But he was committed now, for better or worse. The morning of October 9th, 1851, began ordinarily. Soren left his cabin at dawn to check trap lines along the eastern creek, following his established routine. The weather was clear and cold, typical for early October in Montana. Frost covered the ground, crunching under his boots. The autumn trapping season was producing adequate results, not spectacular, but sufficient to rebuild his depleted finances slowly. He expected an ordinary day of ordinary work. The earthquake began at approximately 9:30 in the morning. Soren was kneeling beside a beaver dam examining a trap when the first vibration reached him. The sensation was similar to the earthquake 2 years earlier, but immediately stronger. The ground rippled in visible waves. The creek water sloshed violently against its banks. Trees swayed with motion that had nothing to do with wind. The rumbling sound from deep below was louder this time, a grinding roar that felt like the earth was tearing itself apart. Soren tried to stand and fell to his hands and knees. The ground was moving too violently for balance. He watched a section of creek bank collapse, sliding into the water in a chaos of dirt and rocks. A large pine tree 50 yards away tilted and crashed down as the earth beneath its roots shifted. The shaking continued far longer than the first earthquake. 15 seconds passed. 20, 30. The motion varied in intensity, sometimes easing to a tremor, then surging back to violent shaking that made standing impossible. At 43 seconds, the earthquake stopped. The silence afterward was profound, broken only by the sound of disturbed water and settling debris. Soren's hands were shaking. His heart hammered in his chest. This had been a major seismic event, far more powerful than the minor earthquake that had started his obsession 2 years earlier. His cabin. The thought hit him with sudden urgency. He abandoned his trap lines and ran toward home, stumbling over terrain that had been altered by the earthquake. New cracks split the earth. Sections of hillside had slumped downward. Trees lay fallen across familiar paths. The landscape had been reshaped in less than a minute. He reached the clearing where his cabin stood and stopped, breathing hard, staring at the structure. It was still there, still upright. The spring assemblies had compressed and extended wildly during the shaking. He could see that from the disturbed ground around the wooden bases, but the cabin itself appeared intact. No visible damage to walls or roof, no collapsed corners, no warped door frame. Soren approached slowly, circling the structure, looking for failure points. The logs remained horizontally aligned. The corner notching showed no separation. The roof sat properly on the walls. He climbed onto the platform and entered the cabin. Inside, items had shifted and fallen from shelves. His coffee pot lay on the floor again, just like 2 years ago. But the structure itself was undamaged. Not a single cracked log. Not one failed joint. The springs had worked exactly as he had designed them to work. Soren left his cabin an hour after the earthquake and began visiting neighboring structures systematically. He needed to know how other cabins had fared, needed to understand whether his spring foundation had actually provided meaningful protection or whether he had simply been lucky. The answer revealed itself within the first mile of travel. Erik Thorvaldsen's new cabin, the one built so carefully with community help just 5 months earlier, had suffered catastrophic damage. Soren found Erik standing outside, staring at his ruined home with an expression of stunned disbelief. The northeast corner had separated completely, logs pulled apart at the notched joints by differential ground movement. The door frame had collapsed inward, trapping Erik inside for nearly 20 minutes after the shaking stopped until he managed to kick through the weakened wall. The roof had shifted and now sat at an angle, no longer properly supported by the compromised walls. "It just came apart," Erik said quietly when he noticed Soren. "I thought I built it strong. Good notching, tight joints, everything right. But the ground moved different amounts under different corners, and the whole structure twisted. I felt it tearing itself apart while I was inside." Soren examined the damage carefully. The pattern was exactly what he had feared 2 years earlier when studying foundation problems. Rigid connections to earth meant the structure had no choice but to follow ground movement. When the earthquake created differential motion between foundation points, stress concentrated at the corner joints until they failed. "Your cabin?" Erik asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No damage." Erik turned to look at him fully for the first time. "None?" The springs compressed and moved. The cabin swayed, but nothing broke, nothing separated. Erik's face went through several expressions, ending on something that looked like anger mixed with resignation. He walked to his collapsed doorframe and kicked at the splintered wood. 2 years you've been right and we've been wrong. 2 years we've been calling you crazy." Bjorn Anderson's cabin had fared better than Erik's, but still showed significant damage. The chinking had fallen out of entire sections of wall, creating gaps wide enough to pass a fist through. One wall had bowed outward by several inches, the logs flexing in their notched joints. The structure was repairable, but would require weeks of work. Bjorn was outside when Soren arrived, already mixing clay for fresh chinking. "Don't say it," Bjorn muttered when he saw Soren approaching. "I wasn't going to say anything. Your cabin's fine, isn't it? The one on the Fool Springs that everyone knew would fail." "It's fine." Bjorn threw his mixing stick into the clay bucket hard enough to splash mud onto his boots. 7 years I've been in this territory. 7 years building cabins the way everyone builds them, and it takes one earthquake to prove I've been doing it wrong the whole time. The survey continued through the afternoon. Magnus Nilsson's cabin had lost part of its roof when the supporting structure shifted. 2 other trappers had structures with cracked corner joints and separated walls. A prospector's supply cabin had collapsed entirely, though fortunately no one was inside when it happened. In total, 7 cabins within 10 miles of Soren's location had sustained damage ranging from significant to catastrophic. Soren's cabin, suspended on its mocked spring assemblies, was the only structure that had emerged completely unscathed. The week following the earthquake brought a steady stream of visitors to Soren's cabin. They came individually or in small groups, ostensibly to check on his welfare, but actually to see the spring foundation with their own eyes. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by something more complicated. Not quite apology, but a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps Soren had understood something they had all missed. Erik Thorvaldsen was the first to ask directly. He arrived 3 days after the earthquake, his damaged cabin temporarily patched but still unsafe for winter habitation. "I need to rebuild before snow. Would you help me build it your way, with springs?" Soren agreed without hesitation or resentment. They discussed specifications and materials for an hour, Soren explaining the principles as simply as he could. Ground motion isolation through flexible connection, load distribution across spring assemblies, compression reserve for dynamic loads. Erik listened carefully, taking notes on bark paper, asking technical questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply copying by rote. "Why did you share this freely?" Erik asked as he prepared to leave. "After how we treated you, you could have refused, made us figure it out ourselves or pay you for the knowledge." Soren had thought about this question during the long winter. "I wasn't trying to prove I was smarter than everyone else. I was trying to solve a problem. If the solution works, it should be available to anyone who needs it. Keeping it secret doesn't help anybody survive." Gunnar Sorensen visited next, his earlier resentment replaced by professional curiosity. He examined the spring assemblies closely, testing their compression with his weight, studying how they had weathered a year of outdoor exposure. "The iron held up better than I expected. No significant rust, no deformation under load. I was certain something would fail." "You built them well. I built them thinking they'd be interesting scrap metal after you got killed in the collapse." Gunnar ran his hand over one of the coiled sections. "Instead, they're the only foundation design in the territory that actually worked when tested. I've already had 3 people ask me to fabricate spring assemblies for them. If you don't mind, I'd like to continue making them." "I don't mind. I never wanted exclusive rights to the idea." Bjorn Andersson's visit was shorter and more awkward. He stood in the clearing, looking at the elevated cabin for several minutes before speaking. "I was wrong. About everything. The springs, the location, all of it. I thought you'd lost your mind, but you were the only one thinking clearly. You weren't wrong to be skeptical. It was a strange idea with no precedent. Anyone rational would have doubted it. Maybe, but I should have doubted it more quietly." Bjorn managed a slight smile. "Magnus is already changing his stories. Now he's telling people he always thought the springs might work, that he was just playing along with the jokes." Soren laughed despite himself. "That sounds like Magnus." Over the following weeks, the visitors continued. Some came seeking advice on spring foundations. Others simply wanted to understand how Soren had conceived the idea. A few never acknowledged they had been wrong, but asked technical questions that revealed their interest. The social isolation that had defined the past 2 years dissolved gradually, replaced by a new role Soren hadn't sought out but accepted. He had become the man who understood something important about surviving in earthquake country. Through the winter of 1851 and into 1852, spring foundation construction spread through the northern Montana territory. The adoption wasn't universal. Many trappers and settlers continued building traditional cabins, either because they couldn't afford the iron required for springs or because their locations showed minimal seismic activity. But in areas where earthquakes were common, the new technique gained acceptance rapidly. Erik Thorvaldsen completed his spring-suspended cabin in November of 1851, working with Gunnar Sorensen to fabricate the assemblies and following Soren's guidance on construction techniques. The resulting structure was similar to Soren's, but incorporated modifications based on Erik's own ideas. He used 5 spring assemblies instead of 4, adding 1 in the center for additional support. The modification worked well, providing even more stable load distribution. Gunnar's blacksmith business transformed substantially. Before the earthquake, spring fabrication had been an embarrassing anomaly he tried to distance himself from. After the earthquake, it became a specialty that set him apart from other frontier metalworkers. He refined his fabrication techniques, reducing the time required to produce each assembly and improving the consistency of the coil dimensions. By spring of 1852, he had fabricated springs for 6 additional cabins and had orders for 4 more. The designs evolved as different builders contributed ideas. A Swedish prospector named Olof Johansson built a smaller cabin using 3 spring assemblies in a triangular configuration instead of 4 at corners. The arrangement worked adequately for his lighter structure. Bjorn Andersson experimented with wooden compression springs, cutting costs by eliminating metal, but accepting reduced durability. His wooden springs functioned for 1 season before the timber began to fail, proving that iron's expense was justified by its longevity. Magnus Nilsson, true to form, spread news of the innovation throughout his travels. The stories were no longer mockery, but genuine accounts of earthquake survival. Other communities beyond the immediate Montana territory heard about spring foundations through Magnus's network. By 1853, spring-suspended cabins were being built in Wyoming and Idaho territories, often by men who had never met Soren, but had learned the principle secondhand. Not everyone who attempted spring construction succeeded. A trader named Samuel Cotton built a cabin on springs in 1852, but failed to properly calculate load distribution. His springs were too soft for the structure's weight, compressing nearly flat under the cabin's load and providing no reserve for dynamic motion. During a moderate earthquake that same year, the springs bottomed out, and the cabin effectively dropped onto rigid foundation, suffering damage similar to traditional construction. The failure reminded everyone that spring foundations required careful engineering, not just copying the visible elements. Soren helped where he could, answering questions and reviewing plans when asked, but he never claimed authority over the technique. Other builders contributed improvements he hadn't considered. The collective knowledge grew beyond what any single person had developed. Soren Eriksson left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1858. The fur trade had been declining for years, beaver populations trapped out in most accessible areas, and younger men were replacing the old mountain trappers. He was 39 years old and tired of winters that started in September and lasted until May. He sold his cabin to a prospector named Andrew Klein for $200, a fraction of what he had invested in the spring foundation, but enough to fund his journey west. Klein examined the structure carefully before agreeing to the purchase. Springs still work after 8 years? They compress and expand the same as they did when new. The iron shows surface rust, but no structural deterioration. Soren walked Klein through the maintenance requirements, which were minimal. Occasional inspection to ensure the spring coils hadn't shifted. Verification that the wooden platforms remained level and sound. Beyond that, the system required nothing. Soren traveled to Oregon's Willamette Valley and bought farmland using money saved from 8 years of trapping, augmented by the cabin sale. He married in 1859 a widow named Ingrid, who had emigrated from Norway 3 years earlier. They raised wheat and vegetables on land that never shook beneath their feet. He built a simple farmhouse using conventional construction because earthquakes were rare in the Willamette Valley, and spring foundations served no purpose there. He had 3 children, taught them Norwegian alongside English, and lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to his years in the mountains. When people asked about his past, he mentioned trapping beaver, but rarely discussed the spring cabin. It felt like a different life belonging to a different person. Soren died in November of 1876 at age 58, complications from pneumonia that developed after working in cold rain during harvest. His obituary in the Oregon City newspaper mentioned his farming success and surviving family. Nothing about earthquakes or innovation or cabins that floated on springs. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, his gravestone listing only his name, birth year, and death year. But in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, cabins built on spring foundations continued standing through earthquakes that destroyed conventional structures. The technique persisted through the 1860s and 1870s, modified and improved by builders who never knew Soren's name. Some used metal springs, others experimented with layered wood or leather compression systems. The specific materials varied, but the principle remained constant. Isolate the structure from ground motion through a compliant foundation layer. Modern seismic engineering would later rediscover this same principle, calling it base isolation, and using it in major buildings worldwide. Engineers would write papers about elastomeric bearings and sliding foundations, unaware that a Norwegian trapper had understood the core concept decades earlier using iron springs and practical observation. Soren Eriksson never sought recognition for his innovation. He simply refused to accept that rigid foundations were the only option when the earth refused to stay still. In that refusal, he found a solution that saved structures and lives long after his own name faded into obscurity. The springs eventually rusted away, but the understanding remained. Sometimes, survival requires not fighting the ground beneath you, but learning to move with it.